And I am very pleased to be speaking here today on what I consider a fascinating topic, the topic of stakeholders. So basically, what I want to do is set the scene on perspectives on stakeholders, the way we think about stakeholders, for my colleagues who will be giving you the specialist views. So I'm looking at stakeholders from the point of view of a focal company and the company's relationships with its stakeholders. And how do we define stakeholders? And more importantly, how do companies identify and define their stakeholders and classify their stakeholders? And this is an important question. And what kind of relationships companies have with their stakeholders. Acknowledging that there are conflicts, maybe between the company and different groups of stakeholders, as well as among stakeholders themselves. So stakeholders are not a homogeneous group. Also, to very quickly say something about the traditional view, which is stakeholders versus shareholders, which is a view that we really no longer hold very much, to the idea of creating shared value, of working together, companies, stakeholders, working together to create something bigger for the benefit of both. And then quickly mentioning the role of regulation. Is there a role for regulation in a company's relationships with stakeholders? So I'm intrigued by this frame that TASC has put around this question, trying to link regulation and stakeholders. So why stakeholders? The growing recognition, or the acceptance really, that companies have to take stakeholders into account in their decisions and their actions. And what is a stake? A stake is a claim or a right to something, or people who have an interest in an enterprise or an effort would claim to have a stake. And we have the definition both in the program and up on screen. I'm not going to go into it. But the fact is that there's not always seeing eye to eye between what a stakeholder might consider, somebody, a group or individual, might consider themselves a stakeholder of a company, but that company may not agree that that individual is their stakeholder. So if you take, say, a member of a protest group, the company may not consider that somebody who's protesting outside their headquarters is really one of their stakeholders. They may consider they're just somebody from Rent-A-Mob. But they may, of course, we can see that even Rent-A-Mob people can't be ignored. So stakeholders can affect the business as well as be affected by the business. So we see companies at the center of a web of stakeholders. Usually we may speak about stakeholders with respect to some particular issue, that maybe somebody is a stakeholder at one moment with respect to a company and not later on. It may depend on the issue, and I'm sure this will emerge. So there are various ways of identifying who is a stakeholder, and it suggests how the company thinks about and treats stakeholders if some people are acknowledged or groups are acknowledged as stakeholders and maybe they aren't. So first of all, if we look at it in terms of the moral perspective, we have the instrumental versus the normative view. So instrumental stakeholders are stakeholders who have the capacity to influence what happens to the firm. So the company may need these people because they may influence their profitability, their market share, their ability to get customers or to get finance or whatever. So these people have to be recognized in some way if the company wants to continue in business. The normative view is that stakeholders have to be recognized in some way because they have the right to be recognized, that the firm has some obligation to them, some legitimate obligation to them. So it's that they are a stakeholder to whom you need to behave in a decent way or need to recognize their rights in some way. And the moral perspective, of course, considers the harms and benefits to stakeholders and how the company may influence those harms and benefits. And again, the moral perspective and the creating shared value, if you like, is creating the greatest societal good through working with stakeholders. Because companies, when we talk about business and society, businesses don't work directly with society. They influence society through their relationships with real people and groups. And this is the usual diagram. So the primary stakeholders, I suppose, are above from employees up. And they would be stakeholders with whom the company has direct relationships, either implicit or explicit contracts in some cases, but they would be direct. Below the financial institutions, analysts, etc., community are indirect and not, it says primary stakeholders, they're really not primary stakeholders, but yet their destiny may be influenced by the firm and they may influence the destiny of the firm. So the media, for example, can be a very influential stakeholder in what happens to companies. And in terms of deciding on who's important, which stakeholders are salient, there's been a framework that's been developed, and there are three attributes of stakeholder salience. One is power. How powerful is this individual or these groups? And we can think of power in different ways. So coercive power, that a group of stakeholders is able to force a company to do something. So maybe we can say that regulation is a form of coercive power, that companies must comply or else. And so we can think about regulation in that way. Utilitarian power is that if there's a stakeholder who is able to influence the prosperity of a company, the profit of a company, then in that sense, they're a very useful type of stakeholder. So we look at it, that it's you scratch my back, I scratch yours type of stakeholder and type of power. And then the normative stakeholder. So this is a stakeholder who carries a lot of respect, a lot of legitimacy, or a lot of knowledge. So that if you feel that this stakeholder has a lot of expertise, then you would tend to act on that person's recommendation. So I don't know whether regulation comes into this, that you would feel that regulations are built on some sort of legitimacy or normative basis. Which brings us to legitimacy. that stakeholders who are seen to be, to have a real stake, stakeholders to whom the firm owes obligations. So we might say that if a company is producing widgets and polluting the air in a community, that it may not think of people living in that community as its direct stakeholders, but we would think that those people have a legitimate stake in that company and that that company has obligations to those stakeholders, the very quality of their lives and so on. So you could have stakeholders who are legitimate. If you take that community probably doesn't have power, but it does have legitimacy. And then urgency. With respect to an issue, is there a time sensitivity to it? So if the air is being polluted, is there a time sensitivity that unless this is corrected, that the groundwater will become polluted, that, you know, it'll all get aggravated? So it may be an urgent issue, and we've seen various issues that have come up as urgent issues. So this diagram, which you probably can't see very well on the screen, but what it gives you is all the different permutations and combinations of the possible attributes that a stakeholder might possess. But probably the most problematic one is the one where stakeholders have legitimacy, but they don't have power. And in those cases, those are the cases where companies find it easy to ignore those stakeholders. It is much harder to ignore a stakeholder that has power over you than it is to ignore one that has just legitimacy without power. So without going into a rigmarole about it, I think that's something to bear in mind in terms of what obligations a company has. And finally, when we know this, what does a company do about it? So there's often talk about stakeholder management or managing stakeholders. I've talked about the instrumental versus the normative view. And in my opinion, you should have both views. You can't ignore the instrumental view, but neither should you ignore the normative view, which often happens when legitimate stakeholders are ignored. We also have to bear in mind, and this might come up later, that companies have multiple stakeholders who may have conflicting interests. So it's often said, if you pay your workers more, then you might have to raise your prices. So what does that do for consumers? So the interests of some stakeholders may be in conflict with other stakeholders, and part of the trick is to balance things and to create shared value. So very often companies are at minimum defensive about the way they treat stakeholders, that they may do the minimum that they have to do to avoid getting into trouble. But the new business logic is, let's go from avoiding getting into trouble to actually creating shared value, to creating something good that benefits the company, its shareholders, and other stakeholders. This, of course, in our current environment means restoring trust, because we know that trust in business, especially in banks and financial institutions, has been lost. And working together to create value requires trust among the parties. So I hope we'll hear something about that. So far, we haven't seen, in my view anyway, that much going on to restore this trust. So I hope we might hear some suggestions from the panel. And my question is regulation a substitute for trust, a substitute for working together, or that we can't get trust, so we need to have regulation? Or can we balance regulation and trust? And finally, this is just a kind of conceptual framework in a paper that I had published. But I think, without going into it at all, I think the engaged quadrant is the most interesting, because that's the one that would work to create shared value, where both the instrumental and normative view of stakeholders comes in, and where companies work together with their stakeholders. So I'm going to leave it at that. I think I'm within my time, so thank you.
Thank you.